You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too, now added bonus for free. Welcome, you're listening to Jay's Analysis. I want to apologize ahead of time for some of the background noise, but I am on the road. And so this week's installment of Jay's Analysis has to come to you on the highway, the Lost Highway. I want to talk about a really fascinating book that I read. Today's review and analysis will be the Osiris disorder. Osiris Complex, which is Colin Ross's book about dissociative identity disorder / MPD, multiple personality disorder as it used to be called. And the book is really fascinating. It's basically 30 or 40 test cases, subject cases that he dealt with and engaged in therapy with, and they're all pretty unique, but there's a lot of really interesting patterns that emerge, as we'll see as we look through the book. But I wanted to also mention an article that I wrote a few years ago called The Fragmentation of the Psyche and the Nous, and what I want to do is just give my analysis, my opinion on these topics. I'm obviously not any kind of trained therapist or anyone who has any medical training or anything like that. So this is just my opinion and my analysis of these books. And Colin Ross has other books too that I've also got. I haven't read them yet. I'm about a third of the way into the next book, which he's got a book on the CIA doctors. That is the MK Ultra doctors, essentially. And then there's also another book about satanic ritual abuse, which I've read about a third of, so I might do that one in the future. Might even message him for an interview or something like that down the road. But I want to tie this into some articles that I've written and some of the philosophy and theology that we have in our worldview as Orthodox. And there are some interesting parallels, some interesting crossovers between what a lot of recent research in terms of MPD, DID has come to, and some of the older ideas of Orthodox theology and psychotherapy and so forth. But it's a fascinating topic. It's very, very hotly debated, controversial. And I think the main reason for that is because the causes are fairly difficult to deal with, where you're talking about, in most cases, pretty severe trauma that people endure that led the brain to these fractured states. But I think another reason that it's controversial, and probably the main reason, is because of the predominance of scientism and naturalistic materialism. So the biological reductionism, the idea that the brain and the mind are basically the same thing. Those are just words for the same referent. And there's no such thing really as a psyche or a soul. And I think that's the most difficult hurdle to get past for most people in this kind of a framework, because it's really the older worldviews that posited that a man has a soul, and as we've talked about many times, post-Enlightenment and post-scientific revolution and Darwinism, you get the predominance of the empirico-critical, materialist, predominant worldview. That paradigm comes to basically dominate all the so-called sciences. And there's really, if you have that presupposition, then there's really only a limited number of solutions that you're even going to consider. So if there's a diagnosis, or if there's some problem that actually is based on the reality of the soul or the psyche existing, and the solution to that problem may be involving something spiritual, that will not be considered, precisely because it's outside of the paradigm of materialism. So it's really a kind of a trap that men fall into. And I recently wrote that article about War for the Planet of the Apes, and we talked about the materialist worldview even back in the time of the writer of the Book of Wisdom, right, the early 1st century BC. And in Wisdom, chapters 1 and 2, you have a very interesting description of the life and worldview of the naturalistic materialist. And it's one in which literally the text says, man's life is but a breath. What's the point, right? Let's just basically dominate, do as best we can to subjugate our enemies, every man for himself, social Darwinism type view, right? And that's really what you're led to if there's nothing beyond the here and the now. And it's interesting to me that all the way back in the 1st century BC, the writer of Wisdom was even apparent. He was even aware of that contrast between paradigms, between these worldviews back then. And so what I find interesting about these kinds of cases in these books is that they provide another window into ways that we can try to understand theological truths in a time in history, in a world where metaphysics and theological truths and these aspects of the soul and so forth, spiritual realities, have been jettisoned, right? At least in the modern industrial, post-industrial, postmodern West, right? But you'll notice there are all kinds of replacement spiritualities or replacement woo-woo things that are not questioned, right? Those are all acceptable. It's really only the healthy spiritual tradition or traditions, the Bible, so forth. Those are the ones that we really have to persecute and to put to shame, right? You can go find some UFO cult or anything like that. That's all well and good. But anything to do with biblical patriarchy, masculinity, spirituality, the traditions of first 1,000 years of orthodoxy, that is not welcome. And what's interesting about Orthodox psychotherapy and psychology, this is kind of connected to a talk I did several months ago about the logos and the logoi, and the teaching of both St. John of Damascus and St. Maximus the Confessor. And it's related to that because what we saw with St. John of Damascus in his famous book, The Orthodox Faith, or Defense of the Orthodox Faith, is that you really get a revealed anthropology, and you don't really find that anywhere else. There might be some, ancient Hindu traditions that have some vague similarity to some of the ideas, or there might be something in Greek philosophy that's vaguely similar, but it's not the same, because ultimately, as we've seen in the many Plato talks, the many metaphysics talks, there's not really a sensible anthropology in those views. You either get a kind of materialism, an end result empiricism with the philosophy of Aristotle. In terms of anthropology, man would basically just be another animal, but a quote rational animal, although we have no reason to believe that he is rational. Why is he a rational animal? Given the rest of Aristotle's metaphysic and the very bizarre theology of the unmoved mover, this unknowable God, right? I mean, that's ultimately ends up in a dead end, just as much as does Platonism. And Platonism, although it may talk about the nous, Platonism does not mean the same thing by the nous that the church fathers meant. This is a very radically different perspective. And what we mean, of course, is when Paul in the New Testament writes about body, soul, and spirit. And so there's a tripartite view that we take that is normative. And rather than it being the body-soul dichotomy that was the norm of the West, we also believe in the nous, which is the faculty that God has given man for knowing and communing and seeing him directly. And that nous, that eye for knowing and seeing and relating to God directly has to be purified, because throughout our life, our sins and so forth, or forgetting God and turning away from God, is what clouds our spiritual perception. And so that is a faculty that God has created in all men. And so it's not just mind or intellect and body that constitutes what it is to be a human or to be a man. And in that regard, as we said, the Orthodox anthropology is unique and is therefore a revealed anthropology. And again, where do we get all this? Well, we get it obviously based on the biblical text, but it's also in terms of Christology. So the seven ecumenical councils that really hammered out Christology over the first 700, 800 years of the church. Those councils debated Christology and then Trinitarian theology, the triad, and as a result they painted a picture more or less from Christology, from the revealed aspects of Christ's human nature and divine nature and who he is as a divine person, and then man being made in his image, and therefore that's how one can diagnose man's problems, right? Man's spiritual illness. You'll note, for example, I was recently sent by an Orthodox priest a very nice set by Larche, Dr. Larche, which is the treatment of spiritual illnesses, which is the same principle, right? Kind of Orthodox psychotherapy. And there are many books on this, so if anybody wants to delve deeper into that, they can do that. But the idea here is healing of the soul, essentially, healing of the psyche. And as we're going to see, a big part of that is going to be the integration of the person. So we many times, we might feel divided. We might feel like there's a war going on inside of ourselves, especially if we deal with some sort of vice, or we are, enthralled in some moral battle or something like this. For most people, or anybody who seeks to find a spiritual path, you'll be aware of that kind of a struggle. And I think in more extreme cases, people who might have undergone different traumas, abuses, and so forth, this can result in full-on dissociation, something like when people black out on alcohol, or they take a drug or something like that, and then they're not at home, somebody else is there, they go wild. And then kind of on a spectrum, in a way, Even more extreme cases, the persons who were maybe repeatedly abused as a child can develop the full-on DID MPD with alters and so forth. And then maybe in a way even more extreme and more a more degenerative mental state is something like schizophrenia. And then depending on your worldview, I would say also full-on spiritual possession. So you have this kind of stages or spectrum or whatever, however you want to characterize it, that makes up the range of experience. But it also, that's kind of the dark side of it. It also moves in the other way, right? It also moves towards greater and greater understanding of the world, of reality, of spiritual realities, and of communion with God, and ultimately seeing the divine light, which is, of course, the perennial Orthodox view, especially in the theology of St. Gregory Palamas. So you have this very precise anthropology, but I don't want to over-intellectualize it. It's not like this is some sort of a science experiment dissection where we're going to cut apart somebody's spiritual innards, and it's like you can stack all these parts on top of each other. It's not like that, but it is, these are words or terms that we would say are descriptive of real spiritual realities in the person. So there, as we said, and many Orthodox theologians and many philosophers have noticed as well the tendency in the history of Western theology after Augustine and the split of the East and the West, the tendency to basically only have the dichotomy view in the West, right? And so for the Augustinian perspective, and then later in the Thomistic perspective, there's absolutely no place for the Nous, precisely because the human in this life cannot see God, right? This would deny the beatific vision of Roman Catholic theology. So there's not any way that there could be a Nous or any direct perception of God, given the theology and theological presuppositions of the rest of the Augustinian corpus and the Thomistic corpus. And of course, this becomes the norm for those who might be Catholic and are going to argue with me and say that, well, that's just the opinion of Aquinas and Augustine. Well, no, actually, it's also in many statements in Denzinger where it's defined what the Roman theological position is supposed to be concerning the body and the soul. And I'm not aware of any examples of anyone in the West teaching the Nous. This is completely lost. And again, that's because of the prevalence and predominance of the Augustinian perspective. Now, and again, by the way, the fact that there's a beatific vision shows that you can't have the Nous. Those two things are incompatible. And if you understand these two different theological positions, you would understand that. But you have in the East this long tradition of a much more fleshed out application of spiritual healing disciplines and so forth, and ascetic practice and so forth, that is intended to help the person gain control of the passions that are out of whack. And this is why we believe that the fall essentially threw man's passions out of whack, right? And that's in a way kind of the meaning of spiritual death. It's being under the dominion, under the control of the vices and spiritual sickness. So as a result, then, the idea is that the church is the hospital for the soul, as many of the church fathers have said. And And it's from that perspective then that I come and want to be very critical then of what I think is ultimately kind of a corporate scam. I'm not saying that it's always wrong to utilize medicines or anything like that. Obviously, medicines were given for that purpose, as the Book of Sirach says. But the idea that if man is purely a biological creature, and that's it, reductionistic materialism, then it's naturally going to follow that the establishment's only going to be willing to offer further chemicals, right? If you're just a collection of chemicals, then the only solution to your problems is just throwing chemicals at it, right? And this is really the folly of the over-medicated perspective. There's a lot of other attendant scandals and problems that go along with that, such as the fact that I think many people over the years have been experimented upon, have been test cases for all of these different drugs. I mean, you turn on the television. I don't watch TV, but I was staying in a hotel recently, and I turned on the TV, and it was all pharmaceutical ads. And it's just like, this is something, it's a total dystopia. And why is that the case? Well, for many reasons, as we said, we go back into MK Ultra and the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Corporation and the rise of LSD and all that, in concord with the CIA, which we've talked about many times. And it's kind of part of the Brave New World model of everybody being drugged and medicated. And over the last several decades, a lot of people have been test subjects and or been misdiagnosed and mistreated and so forth, precisely because of the faulty presuppositions. So, I mean, your answers to man's problems are only going to be as good as your philosophy of man. Your solutions are only going to be as good as your anthropology. So if the anthropology is all messed up, as I've said many times, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot of healing. Now, that's not to say that people in the ER or serious kind of emergency room type stuff, that you should avoid the hospital per se. I mean, that's there as well when needed, obviously. But I'm talking more about the holistic healing of the person, because it's even becoming a little more mainstream and acceptable to consider the possibility that illness can also be connected to or associated with lifestyles. And unhealthy lifestyle doesn't have to just be, junk food. It can also be spiritual choices. So I've known, for example, many women who are ardent feminists and are very open about abortion and so forth and so on, and they very young have developed cancer. And some people have connected the fact of having several abortions and so forth with cancer. So there could be a connection there, and thus the moral actions then, as we're saying, could potentially have a spiritual effect, right? In other words, your physical health can be impacted by spiritual things as well. Now, to the ancient medieval world, that was kind of like common sense. Then when man decided that there was no such thing as God or the soul, that was all tossed out, and then pharmaceuticals and plastics and technology, right, can make us into a new man, supposedly. But I think we are finding out, hopefully, that is an empty promise. There's no salvation through floppy disk. No salvation through floppy disk, right? Transhumanist Commodore 64s are not going to save us. So that, I think, is a big point to understand that a lot of people miss. And one of the great things about Colin Ross's book, and presumably the other books, is that he approaches it from a secular perspective, but he's at least open to possibilities, which I think is a positive, a step ahead. He's not discounting anything out of hand, but he's going to approach it, as reasonably and as logically as possible. And so I think the lack of flights of fancy and speculation makes his work also respectable. So he comes at it from a scholarly academic view, and that's why he's, I guess, one of the leading figures when it comes to DID research and therapy. And so we're going to look at a lot of these cases, and what I want to again emphasize, just from my perspective, is that in these cases you're going to see pretty consistent patterns, and what I think those patterns show is going to line up with some of the ideas that we're going to see in the Orthodox Psychotherapy principle in the article that I wrote, Fragmentation of the Psyche and the Nous, and then this concurrent idea of integration and becoming whole, essentially, not being fragmented. Because the reason this is important, and somebody might say, well, why do you even, if this is like a very small percentile of the population, why is this, it's a weird thing. If it's even real, why is this even interesting to you? Well, there is a connection between all of this stuff and MK Ultra, and many of these doctors who were MK Ultra doctors, they were all studying and specializing in this, in DID, hypnosis, etc., etc. So they were plumbing the depths of the psyche, and I'm speaking of, again, Dr. Orn, Estabrooks, Jolyon West, Ewan Cameron, Delgado, all these characters who are the preeminent MK Ultra figures, and many others. They were studying not just hypnosis and drugs, but also MPD, DID, and this kind of stuff. And they wanted to, again, plumb the depths of the psyche to know these secrets, right? And we know that from the government's perspective, from the establishment perspective, this would be ultimately for the purpose of social engineering. That's really the big plan of MK Ultra. It wasn't, the Scarlett Johansson mind control assassin. It was the creation of means and methods of influencing masses of population. And they did that. They came to those conclusions through the case studies and the test studies and the individual cases. And so then from those results, you could project or apply the same principles on a mass scale. And I think that's the real secret of MK Ultra. And this, of course, then ties into all the pop culture stuff and the music and Hollywood and all that. So, and advertising. So let's keep that in mind, that it's not just some bizarre fixation or a flight of fancy or some weird topic. It's also very relevant to, and here's the key point, how the establishment tries to create doublethink and double bind and a dissociative split state for most of the populace. And you say, well, what do you mean? How was that? Well, Orwell talks about everybody believing these completely contradictory phrases, right? War is peace, ignorance is knowledge, and all these phrases are contradictions, but they're, and he also he and I think Brzezinski, they've made the comment to the effect that people will be able to hold completely conflicting propositions in their head at the same time, and they'll be able to contradict themselves within two sentences, and and not even face them. And so those are examples. They may not be as extreme as DID or MPD, but these are kind of minuscule examples of incoherencies and of living in a split state in a way, right? Because it can't be the case that what's the most common one? Something like relativism, right? There is no good and evil, but actions X, Y, and Z that I see out there by protesters are good or evil, right? There's no such thing as good or evil, but that's good, that's evil, that's good, that's evil, right? This is probably the most prevalent one, right? There's no truth. I know the truth. I know the truth, and the truth is that there's no truth, right? That's a flat out, straight up, 100% boldface, staring you right in your eyes contradiction. And yet, I would say easily majority of the population holds that view. They believe something so preposterous. And they're, as a result, trapped in a little bitty ego box, right? They're one foot's nailed to the ground, and the other one is kind of running around in a circle. And that's because of this kind of split that we're talking about here, that Orwell talked about. Now, it's not all the establishment that has caused this. Humans have always had the same mental and spiritual problems, just as they have physical problems. So it's not like all evil is the result of some single secret society. Right? It's not like the Pentagon literally is God and runs every single thing. No. Rather, what makes our era unique, as we've said many times, is just simply that the tactics of psychological warfare and mind control and all this stuff that we're talking about here, dissociative states, it's been scientifically studied like never before. It's been weaponized like never before. So that's what makes our time period in world history unique, is the onslaught of such tactics in levels of sophistication and through means of technology that have never been seen before. And that's what's crucial to understand. So what you hear and learn and come to understand about MPD, DID people, I think, because of all the connections to MK Ultra, really give us an insight into a lot of the basic operating principles of what the deep state, the Pentagon, the big corporations through their marketing and advertising, the kind of state that they would like to create in masses of populations. And if you don't think this is done on a mass scale, I would just direct you to Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, where he says that in the technocratic era, this stuff will be done on a mass scale in various nations. So if that sounds too conspiratorial, well, I'm sorry. The globalists have openly said what they're going to do. So next I want to move on to Colin Ross's book, and then I'll close with some of the comments on a theological level that I made in my article. as we look into Dr. Ross's book, we note that he has, as we said, quite a few cases that dealt with women. And what we start to notice is that early on, many of the cases in the first few chapters deal with traumatization and sexual abuse. And so apparently this looks to be pretty common with mental patients that are females that he deals with. One of the things that popped out was sometimes the obsession with dolls. And you'll notice this in a lot of the symbology of films, music videos, and whatnot. And I never really understood exactly what the significance was, but you'll also find this in a lot of the surrealist artists. If you notice the art of Man Ray, who was a confessed Luciferian, he's always using dolls and these mannequins. And I got to thinking about that, and what is a doll? Well, a doll is a figurine. It's a kind of a collectible toy that you put in a case that you control. And so a lot of children, I think, that end up traumatized might be in the presence of their dolls or so forth. And so the trauma then becomes linked to the dolls, perhaps as triggers. And that actually comes up, I think, in the first case where the first woman that he deals with appears to have some connection to her doll that she believed she could see through. But of course, these were tricks that the mind played upon the traumatized individual. And it's interesting, too, that something I didn't think about that Ross mentions is that he thinks 20% of dissociative identity patients are prostitutes. And so there's always the case of trauma. And sometimes he even mentions the possibility of sexually fitted alters. So this could give credence to the beta sex kitten theory that we see posited in relationship to a lot of conspiracy stuff. Now, in some cases, there are voices, not in all cases. So this is interesting because that's generally always a sign associated with schizophrenia. But MPD-DID is different from schizophrenia because schizophrenia can be very debilitating, and the person can't really function in a job or normal living situations, whereas people with MPD-DID can function and even at times be highly functioning. So we do have the possibility, and if there are the realities of sexual alters and so forth and sex kittens, then this could potentially be used by cults, and there could be some reality to that theory. The only thing is that I'm not sure about, and it may just be because I haven't studied this enough, but I'm not sure if they know how to create that kind of an altar, or if it's more happenstance. I don't really know, but definitely he has come into contact with cases that he thinks did involve ministers, church-related pedophilia, and that should come as no surprise given all the news stories that we've come across and looked at in the last few years. And if you've done any research into this topic, if you've read Craig Heimbeckner's book, or Hoffman's book, or William Kennedy's book, Lucifer's Lodge, or anything doing to deal with the Savile situation and child trafficking, all that kind of stuff, there shouldn't be any surprise, Franklin cover-up, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to note, though, that on pages 36 and 37, he mentions these kind of loops that people get into that have MPD-DID, where they kind of make up these childish sort of double-minded problems that are in their head, such as this woman who is an abused agoraphobic housewife. She, on the one hand, believes that her husband loves her and cares for her. However, he beats her, which leads her to the conclusion that the husband doesn't care for her, and therefore he also doesn't beat her. And therefore, if he doesn't beat her, then he cares for her. So there was this loop. It's a kind of double mind that she would continually fall into. And you see this often in abuse situations or abused relationship situations. And a lot of weird logic and what we might call magical thinking comes into play. For example, one woman on page 40 had a very strange, what he calls an ogre/victim transactional pattern. This is kind of the Shrek model here. She says that victims, she thought, if you ever said you were a victim, are anxious people. Ogres are angry people. Anger and anxiety are related. Bad girls therefore deserve to be beaten. All men are ogres. Bad girls must be beaten to prove that their mothers were right. Good fathers therefore protect girls from bad mothers. Bad fathers leave, and bad girls have bad fathers. Therefore, Charlene had a good father. But this very faulty line of reasoning really was just kind of a cover for her not dealing with, in this woman's case, paternal abuse. He also notes that there could be many reasons why people fail to diagnose this. For one, ignorance of it. Number two, again, as I pointed out in the first 30 or so minutes of the talk, it doesn't fit with the possibility of most people's materialistic presuppositions. But he also notes that a lot of these women had irrational fears and hatred of men because of what they perceived to be, or what actually were, cases of fatherly abuse. But he will also talk about the sex kitten altars, more or less. There's a woman on page 52. So there's this kind of Madonna whore complex that on the one hand, a lot of these abused persons will hate men on one aspect of their psyche, and at the same time they intensely desire to be sexualized or brutalized or dominated by a man. And this is kind of that pendulum swing back and forth to extremes. And I liked, as I said, the fact that he is open to the possibilities of spiritual issues, and in some cases he even admits, again, he has no supernatural bias. In fact, Dr. Ross's presuppositions are, of course, in the other direction. But he's always open to the possibility that there could be spiritual problems. And he admits in a couple cases that there could have been demonic involvement, particularly towards the end of the book, one of the last cases, a case where he says he really didn't have an answer or explanation, and the woman ended up not getting help and either killing herself or accidentally dying. It's not exactly clear, but he points out that Freud decided that incest that was being reported to him by female patients must have all been made up, and therefore was only a Oedipal type desire. But Dr. Ross considers the counter thesis that, well, maybe some of these cases there actually were intergenerational ritual abuse, and that's another thesis that does come up in Ross's books, is that he does appear to consider that, especially cult families, multi-generational cult families, there is the prevalence of generational sexual abuse. And so therefore it would also seem to support the theory that there are then generational cults. And of course many of these could be wealthy and powerful. And in fact, in one of the chapters he even talks about somebody from a wealthy, powerful family being who had been abused, just kind of being thrown off into a mental institute because the family was, I guess, fairly prominent or wealthy, and didn't want their name tarnished. There's also interesting possibilities of the fragments and the altars being awake during the dream state and accessible in that way, and that's why hypnosis and sodium amytal and different approaches are used during the therapy to access the altar, because the altars appear to compartmentalize and house the trauma at times. In many cases also, we do have the mentions of triggers, and the triggers are oftentimes associated with the abuse in some way. The mind might create these triggers. A cult might intentionally create the triggers that they want to see to use in the future for that person. So there does seem to be some basis for this in the cases of the persons that he has diagnosed. For example, dolls. Dolls might be a trigger if someone was abused, holding their doll or something like that, or if the abusers, wore some kind of weird cosplay, like Mickey Mouse or something like that, then that might, Mickey Mouse might forever be a trigger for that person. I appreciate too that Ross on 97 admits that there's a mystery involved in here, and that he doesn't pretend to have all the answers or explanations to what this phenomena of the brain, of the psyche, is. But he also considers, and this is interesting for the time period when this book was written, back in the 80s, or not 1994. Yeah, 1994, it was that he considers the possibility that a lot of trans people or people seeking to change their genders might actually have MPD or DID, and I think that's very likely. And isn't that telling, given where we are, 23 years later in 2017, when this is now supposedly some mass movement, which is really just being foisted upon the population by the Fortune 100 and globalist interests. And it's done by design. But the reason that people are more and more accepting of this, the reason it's not, partly I guess they're trying to make it into a fad. But I think people are moving in this direction because they are traumatized. People in mass are being traumatized by the media. And so you could read this book, The Osiris Complex, and you could think about it not just in terms of these individual cases, but expand this, as I've been saying, to the mass population. And the abuse that happens to individuals in these case studies when they're young could be expanded and exemplified on a national scale to the mass population. And that's what leads to all of this mania and insanity that we're seeing on a Western, American, and global scale. People are losing their minds. And so a lot of cases involve, obviously, suicide. The people are suicidal. Some of the alters actually want to cause the person to commit suicide, or they are programmed in a way. It appears in some cases to have suicide programming. But in chapter 11, he considers that one of the people that he met that was into that had multiple alters, and one or two of which were the opposite gender alters. These people wanted the sex change because of an unresolved MPD DID problem. Now, of course, Colin Ross is not coming from any religious perspective, so he doesn't even necessarily make a moral judgment on whether that's wrong or right, but he is considering the possibility of those people being abused. I also like that he mentions one of the areas that I will make a criticism is that he, on the one hand considers the possibility that demons are real, and he even thinks that there might be demonic possession. But he also seems to say that they're kind of an invention of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary process in the West, particularly due to Western conceptions of evil. So he'll rely at times on Nietzsche and Carl Jung. And if you're interested, you can go to Jay's analysis. I have plenty of critiques of those kinds of philosophies, so I'm not going to go too far into that, but I just don't really see how it's a plausible theory to, on the one hand, believe that there might be demonic realities as part of the human psyche, and at the same time have a kind of a relativistic, in other words, these demonic entities in his view might need to be integrated, but at the same time have this kind of relativistic view that the arising of evil or evil spirits is also merely a psychological evolutionary process, and that it's some form of older lizard brain right at the base of our brain, or whatever, the lizard brain. To me, that doesn't really make sense. But again, this is coming from a secular perspective. But he does, on page 137, admit the reality of cults and the connection of cults to MPD-DID people. He does talk about the possibility of psychics and paranormal, and it does seem to often relate to people with MPD-DID, which, again, we would say might be just spiritual oppression or possession in some cases. And that these things are activated by trauma, he says on page 140. But regardless, most of what we get from Ross's book is that many of the phenomena are real in terms of alters, triggers, compartmentalizations of the psyche, and that the psyche kind of has an architecture. In that there are kind of rooms and compartments where information can be stored, almost like files on a computer. This is pages 147 to 149. And he says the internal landscapes at times can be like a castle wall. They can have the structures like an internal computer. It can have architecture, safe spaces, etc., etc. And so he's found these different means by which to, deal with this stuff in the different people that he's given therapy to. Another interesting point that he makes on the next page, 149, is a point that I've thought for a long time and many others have keyed into, and this is the connection between so-called aliens, so-called alien abductions, and the ritual abuse phenomena. There do seem to be connections between these phenomena, and he considers that as a very real possibility. And he also considers the possibility of certain people that they may not receive healing precisely because they continue to engage in the cultic or self-harming behaviors. Another interesting insight is that there can be very intricate layers and labyrinths of these alters and personas in the psyche. So in one of the cases, there was a fourth or fifth layer, right? And so once he thought he had integrated one layer of the personas, he actually found that there were several more down the road. And again, a lot of abused people, a lot of people that have been through different traumas in their life, they've also been drugged, whether they chose to engage in serious drug abuse or whether they were drugged by their abuser when they were a child. These kinds of drugs, we know, can create dissociation, especially LSD. So the right formulas of LSD and traumas and so forth, you can get quite a bit done in terms of brainwashing and controlling people. This is, again, anyone who doubts that, you can look no further than Programming and Metaprogramming by the MK Ultra doctor himself, Dr. John C. Lilly of Dolphin Flipper fame, LSD dosing flipper. And what he talks about openly in that book is dosing children. So the scientific elite and the big families, they have studied this. It's not a joke. It's not a conspiracy theory. They can write public books about it. But when I talk about it, you call me a conspiracy theorist. Now, he differentiates MPD-DID from schizophrenia. This is an interesting point, by 4 A's. There are 4 A's associated with schizophrenia, which don't have any association or connection with necessarily. They might, 1 or 2, necessarily with persons with MPD-DID. And that would be autism, fallacious associations, ambivalence, and affective disorder. So, in other words, autistic spectrum, they have wrong associations about what the causes of problems are. For example, they might be having headaches, and so they attribute that to the government necessarily beaming rays at them to make their head hurt. Ambivalence, they can't make decisions about, simple things, whether to get a Twix or a candy bar or how to live their life. They have a very difficult time. And then affectation. Now, in the interesting section on the character Anne Sexton, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet who committed suicide in 1974, he has a curious refutation, I would say, of Dr. Martin Orrin, one of the CIA MKUltra doctors, and if I recall, he's one of the characters connected to the creation of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Orrin was also involved in the Hillside Strangler case as an expert witness. And Orrin dismissed Sexton's issues and the consideration is it's considered possible that that might have been part of the reason why she committed suicide. And what excuse me, what Ross does is go through her biography and their interactions and deal with the possibility of Elizabeth, who was this other character in her mind, and the fact that she would go into trance states when she would write her poems, and considers this as a possibility of an MPD-DID alter, and that it might be as a result of generational incest. And that since this was never treated or dealt with, the trauma was never confronted and worked through, that might have been the reason why there was this suicide. And he also considers this as possible for writers Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf, other suicided figures. So I think that's very likely. It's a whole other take on those situations that I've never heard before. And if Ross's thesis is right, that this is a lot more prevalent than most people think, it could be the explanation for a lot of strange behaviors, and a lot of strange behavior like by elite families or people who have been used by intelligence agencies, cults, and so forth. And it's also interesting that a lot of the cases are women. I would say there's only 2 instances throughout this book where it's not, where it's men, maybe 3. And one of those cases isn't even NPDDID. One of those cases is a guy with a fugue state, an amnesia state. And then the last case, second to last case, the woman that he calls Susan, appears to be somewhat demonic, if not fully demonic, and in some way connected to some kind of Hawaiian shamanism. And so it is interesting that in the cases of the demonic type stuff, you do have ritual abuse. It would seem, or some kind of occult connection. I don't think that woman's case was necessarily ritual abuse. But Ross proposes that you would think that if so many people were abducted by UFOs, I'm going to make a point about this, that there would be more information on this now. I learned from Bill, one of the characters, that a psychologically normal, well-functioning person can have an elaborate, detailed paranormal experience, so they think. Minds are capable of creating elaborate inner theaters that seem to respond to chronic childhood trauma in a special way. They create an inner world of personalities amongst the memories, feelings, and conflicts as they're parceled out. So, definitely a good book. I recommend. If you want to begin looking at this topic, we're going to, as I said, look at more of Ross's books in the future. And he had so many books that I just kind of had to pick at random which ones sounded good. But as I said, I wanted to close up with discussing what I wrote in my analysis a couple years ago. In my mind, the reason why a lot of alternative approaches to these kinds of therapies are derided and laughed at is because the goal of most corporate health is not really the integration and healing of the person, but it's more, as we said, a chemical treatment program. And there are many reasons for this, profits and so forth. But the compartmentalization of the information on this topic, I think, is also interesting because it's almost like military compartmentalization. So the pharmaceutical industry, pill-pushing doctors and so forth, they don't have anything to gain by learning the truth on these matters. So they just kind of, the impetus is all going to be for following the status quo. I also think that this could be related to why cannabis is suppressed, because it has a high rate of treatment success for different depressions, cancer, mental illnesses, and so forth, debilitating diseases. And that's also not very advantageous to the pharmaceutical structure. And that really doesn't have anything to do with some conservative war on drugs nonsense. You have these dialectics that pop up in everything, right, where conservatives think that the answer is to, on the one hand, they are fooled into this war on drugs, while at the same time they support these pharmaceutical industries that are really messing people up. And the opioid epidemic that's sweeping the land, supposedly, that's another result of all this skullduggery, I would say. But I would like to point out too that the theological approach has a lot of, how should I put it, has a lot of advantages that you're not going to get in these humanistic approaches, because really, again, it depends on what's true and what presuppositions we have. So alternative avenues, I think, are much more promising for this kind of stuff, particularly when we look at a different anthropology that we find in Eastern theology. And I'm talking about Eastern Orthodox theology, where man is not merely a chemical machine, but is actually a biological entity with a psyche and a nous and higher faculties endowed by God. One of the Orthodox theologians who writes on this notes that the human nous in Eastern Orthodox theology is the eye of the heart or the soul, the mind of the heart. The soul of man is created by God in his image. Man's soul is intelligent and it's noetic. St. Thalassios, for example, once wrote that created beings have a capacity to receive the Holy Spirit and to attain knowledge of God. He has brought into existence the senses and sensory perception to serve such beings. Orthodox theology holds that God did this by creating mankind with intelligence and noetic faculties. Angels have an intelligence and a nous, whereas men have reason, both logos and dianoia, that is, reasoning process, nous and sensory perception. This follows the idea that man is a microcosm of an expression of the whole creation of the macrocosm. The human nous was darkened after the fall, which was a result of the rebellion against reason of reason against nous. But after the purification, healing, and correction of the nous achieved through the ascetic practices of orthodoxy, the human nous can be healed, that is the eye of the heart, and it will see God's uncreated light. It will feel God's uncreated love and beauty, at which point the nous will start the unceasing prayer of the heart and become illuminated, and thus one becomes a true Orthodox theologian. So in regard to the fragmentation of the psyche and the loss of memory, something crucial for the extreme cases of MPD-DID, it's highlighted in a fascinating way not found elsewhere. And this is the possibility of a spiritual dimension to the psychotic disorders, often overlooked and ignored. Strategopoulos, Orthodox theologian, writes, when Paul says they become vain in their reasonings and speculations, pay attention to his choice of words in Romans 1. Almost always, especially in the New Testament, dialogismos is used in a negative sense. That is, human reasoning apart from the Spirit, anti-God reasoning. Christ is aware, for example, in Mark 2:6, that the unbelieving Pharisees were reasoning within themselves. Jesus says, why are you reasoning about these things in your heart? The word is not logismos, but dialogismos, fragmented, scattered thinking, the fragmentation of the nous. You might as well apply this knowledge when you are confronted with cults, heresies, and similar issues. Consider that the same word used today for meditation, could lead to this same fragmentation. Reasoning and speculation of a fragmented nous are terms which are always used in a negative sense in Scripture. Thus, man ends up in a state of ignorance, although he is created with a predisposition towards God and with a nous that is meant to turn to God for help. Love the Lord your God. This is faith, the movement towards God, and is something that we have overlooked. St. Gregory of Sinai clearly states that forgetfulness of God is a disease of the soul and of the faculty of reason. It has a direct impact on human memory, and it thus ends up divided, diffused, and fragmented and prey to evil thoughts. If I forget God, my memory crumbles to pieces, resulting in scattered thinking, dialogismos. That explains deep anguish. What do we do here? What do I do here? What is to be done? What is right? What is wrong? I don't know. Relativism. So the loss of memory, this is me, and its fragmentation thus becomes, I would say, the same pattern, but in a more extreme sense with the people with MPD-DID. And so even more extreme forms of schizophrenia demonstrate this in a profound way, where the psyche's core is so fractured that appears then to dissociate into total incoherence. So alters, by contrast, appear to have be structured to handle and absorb the trauma. My consideration is that this is a result of the fall, and all of us are in some degree fragmented and dissociative, depending on how we have progressed towards God in healing. Now, I'm not saying this in some kind of new agey way, but again, in the sense that if God exists, and the faculty that exists for the unification and integration of the knowledge of God cannot be ignored. That is the nous. So the only way then to achieve this is to get out of our box of ego and of self-worship and relativism. And the cleansing of the nous then comes about through, first of all, metanoia, which is repentance, that is changing one's mind. And that, what I would say, is the first step towards healing in the madness of the modern world. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis. Thank you.